We're standing in the governor's outer office in the Capitol building in Montgomery. And the room that you see around me is restored to its 1869 appearance. When the research began for the work on the Capitol, no one knew what the decorative treatments were in these and the various other rooms. The Secretary of State's room across the corridor had some of its original decorative paint intact and extant, but it was difficult to see because it had deteriorated so much. It had been painted over and indeed wallpapered over. But it gave some indication that the decorative treatments in these rooms were particularly distinctive. A specialist then came to analyze the paint and the colors, and this was done by taking small fragments through the paint layers with a scalpel, which are then examined under a high-powered microscope in color-corrected light to determine the original appearance of the colors that have come down to us. In this room, at some point, the room was subdivided into four, and they did this by dividing the room with a partition wall across the room on this side and another one transverse in front of me. And when those walls were removed, because they were not part of the original fabric of the building, some of the original decorative treatment in this room was revealed. And you can see it over the left-hand side of this door behind me. The decorative treatments in all of these rooms on this floor, in the Secretary of State, in the Supreme Court chamber, and in the Governor's suite, are all a particular kind of architectural trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil is a French expression meaning to trick or to fool the eye. And the idea is to paint on the wall in such a way as to give the appearance of panels of different sizes and configurations arranged with large decorative moldings around them, casting shadows, etc. Now, this had a particular great revival in 19th century America, and there were a large number of very skillful craftsmen who did it. But actually, trompe-l'oeil is a very ancient craft. It was practiced by the Romans and the ancient Greeks. Also, the ancient Egyptians made a lot of the funeral furniture for their pharaohs and everything that incorporated trompe-l'oeil. And this gives you some idea that it's not just a matter of expense or cost. I mean, the ancient Egyptians, or the Romans for that matter, could have had all the marble or gold or exotic kinds of wood that they wanted, but they chose to, in many cases, to paint them, to trick the eye and simulate them in paint. And that craft rose and fell in popularity down through the ages, and then had a huge revival in 19th century America. And the rooms like this one restored now in the Capitol are typical and particularly fine, grand, ornate, skillful examples of that craft. But it's important to also remember that trompe-l'oeil did not just occur in grand buildings like the one we're in. We have worked in 2- and 3-room shacks out in the country, in Virginia, in North Carolina, and even in places like that, rather humble dwellings belonging to the regular folk, the door leading into the parlor or the mantelpiece in the parlor may be made of pine, but then painted in a trompe-l'oeil manner to indicate it was marble, or to indicate that the door was mahogany. So you can see that all levels of society had the taste and the aesthetic where they liked ornamented things. Well, we're standing right now in the part of the governor's suite. This is the governor's outer office, restored to its appearance of 1869. This color scheme is typical of that period on one hand, but also exceptional in others respects because of the extreme vibrancy of the color. We've encountered quite a lot of different trompe-l'oeil painting up and down the East Coast, but one of the things that makes the Alabama state capitol very distinctive is the combination of the rich color with this trompe-l'oeil effect. In this room there are 24 colors, for instance. And when the research was first being done for this building, they had no idea what was in this room at all. But sometime in its history, this office as it is now in its 1869 configuration was divided into 4. And there was a wall across from that doorway to this mantelpiece, and there was another wall across from that wall to here. And when those walls were removed, they found the fragments of original paint that you see now, preserved over the door and over the mantelpiece. There were a lot of other little fragments scattered around the room, which we and the paint specialist came down and documented and analyzed, but these 2 particular examples were in good enough condition that they've been left and preserved as they were found for visitors to see. And so this shows you some of the evidence that we had for the placement of the panels, the arrangement of the colors, and the actual quality and color values of the paints that were used. You can see when you compare the restored color to the original surviving piece that although there has been deterioration over time with wear and tear and grime, most of the colors, the wall color and the color in the molding, haven't actually changed too much considering 120, 130 years have gone by. The biggest change is in the yellow with glue and wallpaper and all different things that happened to the paint effect after the room was first used, before they built the wall. The restoration, as you see it, is painted with flat latex paint with the colors matched to the original colors as they looked in 1869. The actual original artists, 2 artists who painted this room and did all the decorative painting in the Capitol, in some places they used oil paint, and in some places they used distemper paint. In these 2 rooms, the Governor's Suite, it was distemper, which is also a water-based flat paint, which is very similar to the flat latex, which is also water-based that we use now. The remarkable thing about those 2 original artists who made these original designs, part of the quality that they had, when we first go around to paint this, we divide the walls into panels and paint base coats on the wall, as we will see in the next room. And it's fairly unusual when you just have this yellow, this blue, and this wall color that it looks a little bit strange. And it's only when all the other colors come in to make the moldings that all the colors start working together to make a really rather refined, sophisticated image, which is a little bit shocking to our eyes now because we've got a completely different taste. In the cornice that's painted at the top of the wall, for instance, there are 46 individual bands painted in 9 different colors. The moldings around the panels that you see are made up of 16, 17, 18 different bands of color. And the color arrangement around the large panels is completely different to the color arrangement around the narrow panels, but everything together, when it's all finished, makes rather a harmonious, complete effect, which is not easy to do, not easy to work out in the first place. It's much easier for us to follow the original evidence that we had and put it back, but the 2 original artists were really extraordinarily good. One of the things that they did at that time in order to make this 3D effect work is they follow certain conventions. And one of the things that they did is they decide on a light source. In this room, it's in diagonally opposite corners. And what that means is that each panel has a light side and a dark side. The dark side throws a shadow, which corresponds with the light source and the windows in the room. One of the things that they've adopted is a light side and a dark side, and the paint configuration is different for each of those two sides. And now we've got the ruler up here, you can see the actual dimensions of these painted bands. And in through here you can see that these bands are between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch wide. And what happens is when you look at this from the center of the room, these different colored bands optically mix together. And then some of the stripes have hard edges and some of them have soft edges. And when you see that optically mixed together from the center of the room, it produces this rolling effect like a real molding. This feature here with these oranges, browns, yellows and ochres in this room is really distinctive. It's almost as if they were replicating in paint in a stylized way a gold band, like a gold leafing on a molding. And that we've never seen before, and it adds to the particular fine characteristics of this room. This feature is also occurs in the other room of the governor's suite in slightly different colors. So the two original artists did really fine work, and luckily with all the research that's been done, their names are known. And there was an Irishman called O'Brien, and his co-worker was a man of German extraction called Schmidt. And I believe they worked on the Capitol for about 4 years, around 1870. This room is actually dated 1869. Okay, so we'll go now into the other half of the governor's suite, to the governor's inner office, where the work is in progress. And we can see some of the stages involved in arriving at a final design like we've been looking at in this room. Well, this is the governor's inner office, which, as you can see, relates quite closely to the room we were just in, but it's got a completely different set of colors. There are 24 colors in this room. And the arrangement is similar to that room in that there's a large panel with smaller panels in pairs on either side that continue around the room. Again, we were very fortunate that in the architectural changes to this room over the course of time, when that room was divided into 4, there was actually a little bathroom on the other side of this wall, and they punched a hole through this wall right here. And when the Capitol was being restored to its original configuration and they removed the architrave around that door, some of the original painting, in fact a very good piece of it, survived along here. And just like in the other room, our restored painting will go up to meet that, but it will be left exposed and preserved so that everyone can see how we arrived at this information in order to restore these walls. And so we were very fortunate in the fact that that door was put there. Without that happening, this would not have survived. The other evidence around the room was much patchier and more minute than in the other half of the governor's suite. And there was a lot of information there, but nothing quite as graphic as this section here. And one of the most interesting features about this room, being the governor's inner office, it's yet more ornate than the room we were just in. The most obvious difference being the way the narrow panels are divided into 2 colors. And then this piece of original paint up here that survived shows that there is even a design that goes on top of these 2 colors in the narrow panel. It's not very easy to see just at the moment. As we go on further with the restoration, it will become clearer. This is a Gouache Markup, one of the preliminary studies that was done in the research work on this room. And this is what I'm talking about. This is the narrow panel, the color change, and then this stencil pattern which goes over those 2 colors. It's kind of a circular image, you will see, and it's also continuous. Although there's a color change here, the design is continuous. And one of the ways that we were able to work that out was because on this side we've got the right-hand section of the stencil, and on this fragment up here we've got the left-hand section of the stencil. So what we were able to do was put both of those sections together, and in that way reconstruct the original stencil. So this circular pattern will repeat all the way down, but when it gets to here, it will change over to the other set of colors that we saw in the study. And that again is very distinctive to this room and this building. It's a very unusual treatment, but also does have a basis in fact, and that it's probably a stylized version of some kind of conglomerate marble or fossil stone with these particular shapes contrasting against the base colors of the panel. One of the other differences in the room that you can see right now is the ceiling and the cornice in this room is complete. And you can see that the cornice treatment in this room is rather different to the treatment in the room we just saw, which was much paler. Here it's much darker, and the contrast is between the grey and this deep terracotta colour. And those other colours will be repeated in the mouldings that get painted around these large block panels that we've got right now. In the cornice in this room there are 38 bands in 7 colours. And then the striping around to make the mouldings around the panels is usually between 19 and 23 different bands. And as you can see, with the way we go about making these designs is to go in simple stages. And the first thing we do is work out the positions of the panels on the walls. And in most of these rooms, that's documented to a very exact degree from the scattered evidence around the room, and then knowledge of the configurations that the artists use in other rooms. Some of the rooms are completely exact to within a 16th of an inch. This room is about 85% exact, we know, because we were able to find enough evidence throughout the room, fragmentary though that was. So we first of all mark the positions of the panels, paint the base coat on the wall and the base coats on the panels. And that's the position that these walls are in now. This wall is ready to have the mouldings done. It's got 2 coats on. This one's only got 1 coat. So after we've got the base colours and the demarcation of the panels on the wall, the next thing is to begin painting the bands to make the mouldings. These designs are fairly complicated, as I was saying. They've got up to 20 stripes on each side of the moulding. So in order to simplify matters, we divide the work between the 2 of us. So the first phase is to actually draw out the position of the mouldings around the panels, which you can see here. Again, because of the evidence that survived under the door frame, we know exactly the measurements of each of these bands, even though some of them are only a 16th of an inch wide. So it has to be very precise. So we draw it out in pencil to begin with. And then the second stage is for Linda to come back and paint the first 9 or 10 bands, which you can see completed over the door. Then I will go back to the next stage and put the final 9 or 10 colours in on this piece over the door. And then Linda, after I finish, will come back and put the soft edges on the mouldings, the shading, which gives it that final 3-dimensional appearance. So we divide painting the mouldings into 4 or 5 separate actions. And that way it's easy to keep track of all the different colors and where they all go and the relationships between them. Some of these colors are very close in color or tone with very little difference between them, so it's important that we keep everything in the right place, otherwise the final illusion will not be complete. So now you can see Linda actually beginning to paint the different bands to make the molding at the top of the panel. These walls are so high that we have to do it in two stages, one half from the scaffolding and then the other half on the floor. But because of the way we're dividing things up between us, it means that we can each move around different parts of the room and keep out of each other's way. So a lot of people ask if these bands are done with masking tape or with rulers or straight edges, and you can see from looking at the original that the original was not done that way. They may not even have had masking tape at that time, and so we're doing it just the way the original artist did. They're just freehand lines, and we make them as straight as we can, and the way they optically mix, the fact that there are no arbitrary straight edges such as you would get in masking tape makes the final effect even finer and also as accurate as possible to match the original artist's work. My background is in fine art painting. I'm English and went to English Art College, from which I graduated in 1973, and since that time I've done various kinds of restoration work all along. Linda graduated from Alabama and took a master's degree at Georgia University, and we met when Linda was living and traveling in Europe. She lived in Greece for a year, Italy for a year, and then moved on to Paris and London. And we came back to America in 1982 and got married and settled in Virginia, since which time we've done various kinds of restoration projects up and down the East Coast. And Linda's background a little bit different to mine. She's been doing this kind of decorative painting for a long time. I guess the first thing that she did was when she was 7 or 8 years old. A friend came to their house and painted a table in a kind of Pennsylvania Dutch style, and the next day Linda painted her own chair to match. And she's done various kinds of graining, marbleizing, and trompe-l'oeil ever since. And one of the reasons that we met was through our interest in studying the art and the painting in Italy, where she lived for a good while. And we used to go back and study original work in Italy every summer for 5 or 6 years. Okay, we're in the governor's office, the inner office again, on the 15th of July, 1992. And since the last time that we were here, you can see that the striping in the moldings around the large panels, in fact all the way around the room, they're not complete yet, but they're 3/4 complete. They still need the last few shading stripes in order to be complete. But at this time we've also now begun to work on the narrow panels, restoring the stencil patterns that are really rather unusual. Last time we were looking in this area up here, and now that we've got everything uncovered, it's a great deal clearer what's actually happened. We've got these original fragments here of the right-hand section of the narrow panel and the left-hand section of the narrow panel stenciling, which enabled us to complete the design of the stencil, and now you see the colors restored. At the moment, this pattern looks really rather strong, rather dramatic, and somewhat strange. It's fairly unusual in our experience we haven't seen anything quite exactly like this. But it's also important to bear in mind that this will also look differently when all the striping sections these are the original fragments here, get painted in around it to make it moldings. This contrast in the color looks rather extreme right now, but I can show you this is what the finished thing will look like, and the shadings on these narrow panels, which will be going along this side, will calm some of this contrast down. So at the moment now, Linda is actually stenciling the second series of colors in the lower halves of the narrow panels. There are a number of things to notice in this stencil. Because of the original fragments that we have, this is a fairly accurate replica of what was originally done. We suspect that we've lost some fragments of the original, but this stencil that we've reconstructed uses all the historical evidence that's survived. The stencil that we use is cut through clear plastic, through mylar, which makes it slightly easier for us to put back the original work because it's see-through. Of course, the original craftsmen who did this work didn't have mylar, and their stencil was probably made from brown paper, which they used to paint with linseed oil and hang on the wall to dry 6 months to a year before they needed it. The linseed oil made the paper stiff, made it so that you could wipe excess paint off as you moved from one section of stencil to another, and also made the paper a little bit transparent, but not as transparent as the mylar. We have an advantage over them there. Then the other stencils were made at this time out of brass. They were made in factories, stamped out, but most quality craftsmen in our experience tended to prefer to make their own stencils. In fact, they would customize the stencil for the particular room or the particular job they were doing. And this is probably what happened in this building, because there are some fairly complex things to bear in mind when they were making the stencil. They want the pattern to repeat itself in this circular motion as it comes down, but also they have this color change, and the pattern as it goes down in the repeats of the stencil has to be continuous, and it has to be continuous in the color change, so that this pink section here continues the curve of this darker brown section here, and this line of shapes through here continues this curve. So they were very aware of that and controlled and designed their stencil accordingly. And the fact that ours continues to make that process work encourages us to think that ours is correct and somewhat following their original guidelines. You can see on the stencil as well that the one constant edge is on this side, which enables Linda to match the repeats of the pattern as it comes down. But underneath her hand on this side, you can see that the stencil extends, and sometimes it's used and sometimes it's not. The point being that each one of these narrow panels is a different width. If we were laying out the panels on these walls today, it would be very tempting and rather obvious to make the pairs of panels on either side of the main panel the same dimension, to make the interstices between the panels the same dimension. One of the things that again shows the sophistication of the original craftsman is that everything is different. There are no two panels the same width. The spacing of the narrow panels on either side of the wide panel or between the narrow panel and the door frame is always different. It may only be different by 1/4 of an inch, or sometimes as much as 1 1/4 inches, but the effect that this has is making everything lively and non-mechanical. There's no point in doing this kind of work and having everything look just like it's wallpaper. It's something that the original painters were very aware of and accounts for the liveliness of their original work. Even though you are using a repeat pattern coming down, the left edge is always variable, and so different panels will look slightly different, and that will make a big difference to the quality and the liveliness and indeed the sophistication of the look of the final room. It's Friday the 3rd, and we're continuing our work on the governor's inner office. Last time we were in the process of doing the lower half stenciling on the narrow panels, and since that time you can see that the stenciling has been completed and we're quite well advanced on doing the stripings that's going to delineate the molding on these narrow panels. As we said before, it's done in several stages. The upper sections are done first, and then we go around on the lower section. And also, because of the number of stripes involved in this trompe-l'oeil molding, I think in this room there are 36 bands altogether. To make it easier on ourselves, Linda goes first and paints the first 12 or 15 bands, and then I follow doing the final 9 or 10, and after that this kind of the shading on the soft edges that actually complete the molding is another later step after that. Right now on this panel that we're looking at, I've got most of the bands complete. I'm just running the final white highlight down this yellow band through here, and then the only thing left to do on this section will be to do the shading to soften all the edges. So I'm running this white band straight down the center of this yellow, and like all the other colors, it will need 2 coats to get the required opacity, and that's when we can correct any little indentations and blemishes from the variations in the surface of the plaster wall. But now that all the bands and all the colors are beginning to be on the wall, it becomes more apparent the subtlety of the color and the design that the original craftsman made. In this room, there is not so many colors as in the governor's outer office, but the combinations of them are extremely refined. In all the other rooms that we did, the white on the Munsell scale is known as N9. It's a quite rather a white, bright, hard white. And in this room, very deliberately, all the whites in this room are a deliberate, softer, creamier color. And they adjusted the tonality in that way in a very refined manner. Something else that they did that shows the subtlety of the design at work at that time is the shadows in this room, this area here, on the wide panel, this area here. They also softened the shadows in this room compared to all the other rooms where usually the shadow is the point of maximum contrast, is perhaps usually a blue, a violet, and then the dark brown. And this room is beginning to look particularly elegant, partly because of these subtle shifts in the gradations of color that they made. We were talking last time about a similar thing in laying out the panels in this room. And on this back wall, it's very distinctive. If we were laying out these panels today, it would be rather obvious to make the three large panels the same dimension. And the craftsmen back in 1869 very deliberately made them all slightly different. They actually range 44, 42, 41 and a half. And that kind of subtlety is very impressive to see, produces a very elegant effect, and is typical of native ingenuity and skill in 19th century America. Moving along this back wall and onto the fireplace wall, we can see another example of Schmidt and O'Brien's ingenuity in solving the problem of the design of the panels given the architecture of the room. In this corner we have this little oblique angle caused by the masonry wall, because on the other side of that wall is the spring of the staircase on the main entrance into the building. And in all the other rooms over the mantelpiece, the main elements of the design, the wide panel with the two narrow panels on either side of it, that design is usually centered over the mantelpiece. And initially, that's what you would begin to expect in this room. To help us, it's noticeable that the molding pattern on the wide panel is one design where the shadow is made, and another design on the light side, and there's a similar difference on the narrow panel design on the light side and on the dark side. So when we come across a little piece of evidence, it's very easy to determine that it's either a wide panel or a narrow panel, and whether it's the light side or the dark side. So in a sense, looking over the mantelpiece, we expect to find evidence of this configuration of stripe or this configuration of stripe. But in fact, what occurred was we found this configuration of stripe. So that is how we know that over the mantelpiece in this room, Schmidt and O'Brien made a different configuration, probably to balance the window and compensate for this oblique angle in the corner. So that instead of the large panel with a narrow one on either side, the mantelpiece is in fact encompassed by one large panel. And then they accept the fact that you'll get two narrow panels in this corner going around the oblique angle. So now we're looking at the wall with our original example from behind the architrave, and now that we've got the top section, the stripes, restored, you can see above the ruler here is the original work from 1869 with our restored stripes running into and out of it, and Linda just beginning the first stage of the striping in this lower section. You can compare along the various sections of original molding that we've restored, and then this is the other side of the narrow panel. These panels on this other wall are completed with the original striping in place. But these panels are still not finished because they still lack that little subtlety of the soft edges and the shading that makes the complete molding scheme. The wide panels, we've started to put that softening molding in, and a similar amount of work is still to go ahead on the narrow panels, but we are beginning to get towards the finished effect of the room. After we finish the striping on the panels, then we have to complete and touch up the final wall color and then the room gets trimmed out in order to match the governor's outer office. The baseboard will be a very dark blue-black, and the trim will get its final coats of white. And then the room will be finished in terms of the decorative paint. And that we envisage, at the moment we've got perhaps a little over 700 hours in this room, and by the time we finish we'll be around 850, perhaps 900 hours of work on the decorative paint, restoring the governor's inner office.